Michael Soepnel. Michael is the Chief Information Security Officer at OSIbeyond. As CISO, he oversees the cybersecurity and compliance divisions of the company and possesses certifications including CISSP, CCP, and CISA. Michael has been instrumental in assisting DoD contractors with CMMC 2.0, compliance assessment preparation. Introducing Michael.
Thanks, Kate, and good morning, everybody. So on my first slide here, I'd just like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the differences between NIST 800-171 and CMMC 2 Level 2. Before we do that, though, just a couple of quick notes about Level 1. Level 1, the way they've chosen to assess that and build out the objectives for it is effectively a subset of the 800-171 requirements at the moment. It is just a self-assessment, which is definitely a good thing for contractors, but it does still have assessment objectives associated with it, so do not underestimate it if you do want to have a legitimate comprehensive self-assessment against CMMC Level 1, there is still going to be some effort and some burden involved for most contractors. Taking a step back, though, and looking at 171 as a whole, per the DoD, they've determined that 800-171 is effectively the minimum set of requirements that need to be met by an organization to protect CUI. They can be supplemented by additional requirements. If we're thinking about CMMC Level 3, those 800-172 controls, perhaps export control considerations, and other situations with certain specified types of CUI. But that baseline does stay in place, and they do apply regardless of the size of the organization. They effectively follow the data, whether you have 1,000 people or 5. CMMC is the verification mechanism, as we've discussed, that these requirements have been implemented. It's the outside mechanism to do that. CMMC, curiously, in the rule draft that we're all looking at the moment, is locked at NIST 800-171 Rev 2 requirements. Those are kind of hard-coded in the rule at the moment, and we'll come back to why that's interesting in a little bit. Looking at third-party certification, so as of right now, with this 800-171 system that we're operating under, the only true external independent assessments of 800-171 are limited to the small number of DoD DBCAC assessments that are conducted. That's a small group of teams, small number of contracts, relatively speaking. Under CMMC, nearly every single contractor holding CUI will be assessed by an outside private entity or a C-PAO. And we're also looking at mandatory certification requirements now. So practically speaking, all contractors at Level 2 are going to require third-party assessment. There may be some contractors that hold just 1 or 2 contracts that are part of the 5% of contracts that the DoD thinks they're going to allow to self-assess. But again, unless you hold just a few of them and you effectively get lucky, I think it's unlikely that many contractors are going to be able to leverage the self-assessment option at Level 2. We're also looking at attestation for full compliance at Level 1 and Level 2 as well on an annual basis, whereas on the current system, you can disclose an imperfect, less than 110 SPRS score and still be fine. We are going to be looking at an attestation at 100% moving forward. A few notes here just to talk about the relevant DFARS clauses. The first one there, 252-204-7012, I've seen that for a long time, requires contractors to implement NIST 800-171 to protect CUI. And we also have some other requirements in there around incident reporting, the mandate for FedRAMP clouds. That clause is very, very widely included in contracts. I think it's almost universal, without really any consideration as to if the contractor actually holds CUI. It's also routinely flowed down to subcontractors as well, with the same kind of lack of consideration there. This hasn't really been an issue so far because there is essentially no penalty to accepting that clause without implementing the requirements. You can take that clause, not implement them, and as long as you don't have CUI, you're effectively fine. That's going to be a big change when CMMC comes along. For 7019 and 7020 clauses, they were introduced a couple of years ago now to bring us the SPRS scoring system, which is a self-assessment methodology against NIST 800-171. It's also what the DBCAC teams follow when they're doing those third-party assessments for the DoD directly. It did require contractors to perform a self-assessment and require their subcontractors to do the same thing, upload those scores to the DoD to give them some kind of visibility into the supply chain while CMMC is getting off the ground. The 7021 clause is the one that we expect to start seeing sometime next year, which will cover the CMMC certification requirements themselves. Now, thinking back to 7012, it'll be interesting to see if the universal use of 7012 continues, or will they get more selective about it? To me, it seems hard to imagine 7012 continuing to be used without an associated 7021 level 2 requirement. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. I think contractors obviously are not going to be as accepting of widespread undiscriminating use of 7021 as they are with 7012, because 7021 means you actually have to go out and get an assessment. And people are understandably going to be reluctant to do that if they believe they don't hold any CUI. We also need to just think for a moment about possible issues if CMMC remains locked at 801.71 revision 2, as it is now, and DFARS 7012 moves on to 801.71 revision 3. That's waiting in the wings. It's nearly there. Tracking both of those sets of requirements at the same time, which would be what is required under the current language, would definitely be an additional burden on contractors. And I really hope we don't see that. What would be preferable, obviously, is that we stick to Rev 2 of 801.71 through the first round of CMMC assessments and just get that first cycle over and done with. But time will tell there. Okay, some comments on the CMMC accreditation body and the overall ecosystem. This was created by the DoD to solve a problem they had with assessment scalability. As Pi mentioned a little bit earlier, the DIB, is too big to assess by the DoD all by itself. There was no appetite to scale up those teams to kind of the size that would be needed to cover the entire DIB. So the solution here, quite cleverly, is to have the DIB fund its own assessments effectively. So the CyberAB was spun up to do that. They're responsible for both the training and certification of assessors through the CACO, that's your CCAs and CCPs, and then the CyberAB themselves are responsible for the consultation side of things, RPs, RPOs. The CyberAB does maintain a marketplace on their site, which you can use to find C3POs, CCPs, CCAs, RPs, and so on. I would definitely suggest using that for reference. You can use that to cross-check credentials, absolutely. But definitely perform your due diligence outside of that on a vendor, especially a consultant that you're thinking about working with. There is kind of a wide range of expertise out there in the market. For consultants and C3POs as well, there are some other considerations. A big one that I think is very important is their familiarity with your industry and your company size. When we have, say, a software developer versus a manufacturer versus a professional services or construction firm, those are very different environments, different software. One may have industrial automation, one may have CI/CD type software development processes in place. You need someone who actually understands those technologies fairly well. Size is important because if you're a company of 10 people, your capabilities, your internal IT resources are going to be a completely different ballgame to a company that has 500, 1,000, 2,000 people. We also want to think about the overall solutions that you use, especially if you use something other than GCC High. GCC High is very popular with good reason, very complete set of capabilities there. But if you use an Ignite or a Prevail or a Google Workspace, you have a bunch of Macs, you want to start talking about those things with your C3PO and consultant of choice really early in the discussions, just to see, are they familiar with that? Are they used to implementing and assessing the requirements on those platforms? So ask these questions up front when you're shopping, when you're talking to Matt or another C3PO, just get some background information on their expertise and what they're comfortable assessing and working with. When we're thinking about the actual assessment preparation process itself, the first thing that I think is very important is scoping. So everyone involved needs to understand the scope of the environment from the very first day that you start to work towards this. Keep coming back to it when you're talking about the environment, when you're talking about the requirements themselves and how you're going to implement them. Reference the scope, keep looking at the diagram. That's not just for IT people. When you think about the training that you're giving to all of your employees on the handling of CUI and where it is and where it shouldn't be, that is effectively scoping training. So approach it from that angle. Try to disseminate that information out as much as you can so people understand the boundaries of the system, particularly the FCI versus CUI boundaries. You're most likely going to have a wider FCI boundary than CUI, and make sure everyone knows more or less where that is. Not necessarily from a purely technical perspective, but just the basics in terms of where that information should or should not be. For assessment objectives, so these are present in NIST 801.71, copied directly into the CMMC assessment guide as well. Track them very, very kind of religiously and closely. And this language that is used in those objectives can be kind of unclear to IT folks, people from a purely technical background sometimes. Make sure the requirement is understood. We've seen situations, unfortunately, where an IT team has spent time and money and the work has been done to support a requirement, but it wasn't quite on target as far as satisfying that. Some rework and so on and so forth has to happen. Do track the requirements individually versus the scope. So hopefully your GRC software or whatever you're using to track your compliance does this for you. You want to be tracking 3.1.1 A versus B versus C. If you're tracking at a higher level than that, you're just looking at 3.1.1, it's very easy to overlook a single assessment objective. They're often related within a single practice, but not always. Sometimes you will have one that's a little bit from left field, and it's very easy to overlook that if you're only looking at the high level language that's involved. And again, keep rereading them. When you're having conversations internally about how to implement a requirement, do we meet it, do we don't, have the text on the screen and just keep going over it. The last point I have is really just about the resources required and just being realistic with that. Your existing IT team doesn't have the time to do this. It's just the way it is. This is a significant new burden for most companies. You're going to need extra full-time employees, consultants, perhaps a mixture of both to build this program. As part of this, if you're implementing 801.71 from a relatively immature sort of level of compliance, you are going to have a brand new list of recurring activities that need to happen every week, every month, every quarter, every year, and so on. And someone is going to need time to keep up with those so you have credible evidence when the assessor walks in the door. We've seen some clients be very successful when they've had an in-house IT resource that has the institutional knowledge, the technical knowledge about the organization. They've been transitioned into a full-time GRC compliant cyber role. Their IT resource has been backfilled by a new employee, and they've actually been very effective in implementing the requirements. So if that's an option for you, I would definitely encourage it. Do, however, need to ensure that there's some redundancy and some overlap in the knowledge. If you have one person within your organization, full-time employee that has all of your CMMC know-how in their head and they leave, you're going to be in trouble because this compliance program needs to be maintained over a period of time. So I would suggest either have multiple people in-house that have a good knowledge of what's going on that can go through your SSP and explain what it's all about, or have someone in-house, have a vendor as well. Do not just rely on one internal person or one vendor. People leave, vendor contracts are not renewed for all kinds of reasons, and you need to make sure that program keeps going. Again, unfortunately, we've seen clients go through projects, migrations, work towards this, and then someone leaves and it all stops for a year or so, and a lot of what was done is effectively lost. An investment is lost at that point. So with that, I believe I'm handing it off to Matt for the assessment perspective.